Sumeet Jaswal, welcome.
Thank you.
How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. You're joining us from where? British Columbia?
From British Columbia. That's correct, in Canada.
Awesome. Um, this is pretty fascinating, actually. I've been billing this as you are as far as we know, the only person in the world currently studying Misokinesia.
Me and my PhD supervisor. Yes, that is
Right.
correct.
How does that feel?
Didn't realize what we were getting into 6 years ago when we started this research. We
Mhm.
just stumbled upon this where we were looking into misophonia because there is so much research on there. And then one paper mentioned misokinesia, and then we started looking into it. And because we are the first people, we kind of did some studies that you're going to talk about that now in hindsight I should have done differently, but that's
Mhm.
because, well, hindsight's 2020, right?
Certainly. That's pretty fascinating. Thank you for researching this. I'm assuming that the people who are joining us know what misokinesia is, but maybe you can fill us in on your sort of working definition of what misokinesia is.
It's going to be hard to switch to
Right.
Misokinesia for this presentation. Yeah, so the way that we define it is the way that Schroeder defined it initially
Mhm.
in 2013 in the paper, where I believe they defined it as a strong negative emotional response to the sight of someone else's repetitive and small movements. So somebody else is making some type of movements and you're having a strong emotional response to it.
Yeah.
But I believe you had a nice distinction between misophonia and misokinesia that I really liked. And I actually brought it up with my supervisor. He's like, that's really good. We should definitely cite it in another paper when we're writing it, where it has to be with whether there's sound associated with it or not. If there's sound associated, then it has to be misophonia. If there's no sound, then it would be misokinesia. And that's a really interesting distinction between the two.
Well, thanks. That we're just using that as sort of our current definition of it. If you look at the consensus definition of misophonia that was published, I don't know, 3 years ago, it says that visual elements associated with auditory um, triggers in misophonia are part of misophonia, and
Mm-hmm.
things that are movements that aren't necessarily associated with the sound we're kind of thinking of as being misokinesia. So like foot shaking and so forth doesn't really have a sound.
Yeah.
I don't know if that works or not. That's just how we're defining it on this end, but maybe.
And I think that
Yeah.
distinction is definitely important in research, especially when it comes to academic research, because that's the pushback that I get when I'm trying to publish papers, where people just say that, hey, this is not even necessary. There's so much stuff that we know about misophonia. Why are you even doing this research? So that's definitely the pushback that I get from reviewers. And so having that really clear distinction would definitely be important.
Fascinating. Let's take a few steps back. How did you get into this? Why was this your topic? Where did researching this come into play for you?
When you start your PhD, you need to come up with the topic that you want to study. And I was interested in something to do with visual attention because that's what I was doing my PhD on. And we looked into misophonia because I have misophonia. We talked about it in one of our meetings, and then started reading some papers. And that's when I stumbled upon that Schroeder paper.
Mhm.
And then my supervisor mentioned, oh, interesting visual movements because my partner gets bothered anytime I'm tapping my foot. Do you wonder if that's actually a thing other people have? I don't have misokinesia, so I didn't know this was something. And then so we started looking into more of it. And anytime you look it up online, there was all these Reddit posts, Google posts, but nothing actually academic on it. So that's how I got into it.
Interesting. And where do you start? Let me post a link to your first paper that came out in 2001. But when you were assessing,
2001.
up to 2021.
Yeah, I was like
My
2001. I wasn't
apologies.
doing my
Hang
PhD.
on a second. The brain has gone. Let me post that real quick in the chat. But this was your first paper from 2021, and
Yes.
this was a very much laying the groundwork of prevalence and so forth. And you had a
Yeah.
pretty interesting start, and then you had a pretty big sample size. So maybe you can tell us, going into this first paper, really about misokinesia itself, how you laid that
Yeah.
groundwork.
So because we had that conversation where does this even exist? It seems like it does exist. So we wanted to look it up in our university sample. So at University of British Columbia here in Canada, we just asked this question. So we have this subject pool, human subject pool. So it's undergraduate students that are taking psychology courses. They can all answer those questions, and they get some credit for this. And so we just asked a simple question: do you ever have strong negative emotions when you see somebody else making small repetitive movements. So we took the definition that we had for misokinesia and we put it on there of, do you ever feel it? So we're not asking for severity levels, just have you ever felt this? And about 2,700 participants responded to this. And more than a third of them said yes, that they did at some point, they ever felt this strong emotional response to seeing somebody else fidgeting. So that gave us a green light to keep going with this research. And then we went on to our the other two studies that are mentioned in that paper.
Awesome. So it's incredibly prevalent based off of this one.
Yeah, and this was a university sample. Granted, so it is quite limited in who we are asking. So it's usually younger participants that we are asking this. They're usually in 18 to 25 range. That's usually the demographic that we're looking at. And they are pretty diverse in ethnicity when they come to university, but still, we talk about it in psychology that the samples that we're looking at are very weird, where they're Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So that's why we did follow this up with a more of, I believe I ran this on M-Turk, so we had more of a diverse population in that one, where we asked the same question again. And we got a similar result that it was, again, about a third.
That's amazing. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
that have some sort of clinical symptoms, presumably, of misokinesia.
Yes, yes.
Gotcha. We talked about, I was at a conference last week with the Misophonia Research Fund in Chicago, and they were discussing this issue that maybe, I'm not a scientific researcher, I'm a theater person, so I'm kind of learning this as a layperson, but getting that slice of life sample of a population is difficult. Like you said, you tend to get college students who actually are very kind of homogenous sometimes, or a very specific age and income and so forth. If you were to do a much larger sample on a future study, how might you go about doing that to get kind of a really good slice of the population?
That's the harder part, because there are online places where you can get research participants, like M-Turk was one of those places, but recently more research has shown that M-Turk's not actually humans that are doing it. It's a lot of bots. So a lot of people just teach bots to do their research for them. And we do have attention checks in there where we believe humans can pass those, but then again, they just train the bots to do those for us. So it's really hard to get more of a diverse populations. We clearly haven't figured it out. I'm sure other researchers have figured it out, but in our lab, we're kind of limited to the university populations.
That's pretty well. It's a strange time to be alive, where we're competing with robots for scientific studies. So this first paper that I posted a link to actually has a lot in it for a preliminary paper.
It's a pretty big paper. That was a monster to write, for sure.
Yeah, you started with a pilot study. I was reading through it, and you did 2 assessments as kind of part one. There was a behavioral assessment of visual attention and a peripheral attentional orienting inhibition assessment. Were those already sort of established prior to this? Those were kind of industry standards for those types of things for other things?
So visual attention, yes. So the paradigm that we made, we basically adapted one that was already there in visual research, where there's 2 things on the side, something flashes, does your attention get caught by that? That's a pretty standard way of looking at attention, and where if something flashes in the middle and then now something flashes here, do you look here or not? We changed that a little bit, where we make things wiggle rather than flashing, because we thought that rather than flashing, we wanted to look at wiggling, because that might be a proxy to human fidgeting. Turns out that's why we got some null results, because human fidgeting and animated fidgeting is processed differently in the brain. We thought that maybe there would be some overlap, but we didn't find anything there. So that's one of the null results that we had. And then we ran it again with the flashing paradigm. Again, null results there. So that paper is a lot of research, but a lot of null results there. But they are interesting in their own way in that sense as well. That's what we learned from research of what things are not. They tell you a lot about what things are. So that study, we had 3 different paradigms where we were looking at visual attention, and they just came up with a lot of nothing. So what we did understand from that is that maybe with misokinesia, it's not that you're having trouble ignoring distracting stimuli, but maybe it's more of that distracting stimuli keeps taking your attention. So it's not that you can't look away from it, but it's the fact that you keep looking at it. Maybe that's the problem. But again, we haven't found that yet. I haven't done that specific study yet. There's a lot of maybes at this point.
Interesting. I think this is what I think of is in the misophonia world specifically, we talk about sensory gating from an auditory perspective, and that's where our brains naturally, without us knowing it, tune out things in the world that aren't important, or at least that our brains don't deem as important. It's the cocktail party metaphor, where if you're at a cocktail party, your brain is not processing the 30 conversations going on in the room, only the one that you're involved in. Our brains do that automatically. Is that peripheral test visually sort of like the sensory gating test of whether we're able to tune something out that's not important or not?
That was what we were trying to see, where if there's something in the periphery that's not important to your task, do you tune it out? Is it that something wiggles but the task is going to happen in the middle? Would you just tune that out? That was the first study that we ran. And then we followed that up with, now things are wiggling on the side, but now the task is actually where you have to attend to the thing in the middle of it.
Oh.
Now do you look at that? Again, we got some null results there. So we were looking at whether people are able to ignore things in the periphery or not. Because presumably that is what bothers us when you have misokinesia, is things in the periphery where you're trying to have a conversation with somebody, but somebody else is wiggling a pen, or the person themselves is wiggling a pen, and now you just keep looking at the pen and you can't not look at the pen. So that's what we were trying to do there.
Pretty wild. There were a few other things that you sort of found within this. Again, it's sort of a groundwork paper as the first really just about misokinesia and some of the facets of it. Another one was variability. What did you find as far as variability with misokinesia from this one paper?
So like I mentioned, the first study that we ran, we had undergraduate students at university that were there. So they're more younger population. It's mostly female population because psychologists tend to be more, psychology undergrads tend to be more female oriented. So we had female, younger population, and we found that most of the participants, they responded that yes, they did have it. Oh, and then I should mention that we actually created a questionnaire there where we looked at the severity levels of misokinesia, and we got participants to respond to that questionnaire. And what we found in the undergraduate populations, that most of the participants were on the lower end of the spectrum when it comes to misokinesia sensitivity. But then when we followed this up with that MTurk population, which is supposed to be more of a global population, it's anybody from around the world can respond to this questionnaire. If they're not bots that are responding, they're actually humans. Then we had more of older population, more male population, more Caucasian population, and they had higher severity levels. That's what we found there. We saw some of this differences. So maybe it gets worse with age. Maybe there's a difference in gender. Maybe there's a difference in ethnicity. But again, we don't know yet. That's why the paper was a groundwork paper where we left it up to a lot of questions.
Fascinating. So I guess because it's so interesting to me because I've been following misophonia research for about the past 5 or 6 years, and a lot has happened. But looking forward, we can see that there's groundwork things that need to be done right off the bat for misokinesia, like a consensus definition possibly. And when you're talking about prevalence of symptoms and then it being and having an impact on somebody's life is kind of a challenge to test. So a lot of people, I'm guessing, might have symptoms of misokinesia, but if it doesn't have an impact and it's manageable in their life, it's not really quite the disorder yet. How might you, I know we don't have an assessment for it yet, but how might you test for that? And what might a validated assessment for misokinesia look like? Because we'll probably need one pretty soon.
Yeah, and that's why at this point I'm just calling it more of a psychological phenomenon, because so I got my PhD in cognitive psychology. I'm not a clinician by any means. I don't know how to work with clinical patients. I wasn't trained on that at all. So if we were to create more of a clinical definition to see how it's actually impacting individuals, we would need to work with clinicians for that. So maybe that looks like working with doctors for this or working with clinical psychologists. I'm not sure how that looks like, but that would require somebody with more expertise. Maybe somebody that has expertise in misophonia could lend hand there. I'm not too sure how that works. But that would require some collaboration in the future. I think that's where us cognitive psychologists are not able to do that work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might turn out to be very complicated the way misophonia was. I know
Yeah.
misophonia 10 years ago was suspected of maybe being purely psychological and related to OCD. We now know those two things were kind of not great speculations. It's very complicated. So looking forward, I'll post the link to your next study, and then we've got a few questions to go over. But this was your more recent study, that and paper that was published. I like this because it actually has the word oddball in the title. I've never seen that in research, which I think is cool. But tell us a little bit about this one. This is sort of an extension of the work from the first one a few years later. But tell us a little bit more about what you were looking for in this particular visual attention orienting study.
So a couple of things there. So that study was an EEG study, which means electroencephalography, where we put electrodes on people's heads and then we see how their brain responds to something that we show on a screen. And again, this is more of a visual attention thing that we're doing there. And we wanted to see, because our definition involves emotional experiences, so we wanted to see if participants with misokinesia have different emotional responses to seeing different emotions. So is it that they process happy emotions more strongly? Do they process angry emotions more strongly? So we wanted to see that. And then so basically that is what we did. So emotional oddball paradigm essentially involves looking at neutral stimuli, and then every once in a while the oddball, which would be a happy face or an angry face, shows up, and then you're supposed to press a button. And anytime that oddball face shows up, then I forget, where is that, when you press the button or you press the button for the neutral? Regardless, there's a response that is involved there. I ran this a few years ago. And so we wanted to see how the brain processes that oddball. So is it that the brain, for somebody that has misokinesia, do they respond more strongly? And we can see that with the electrodes on the head, where we can see specific brain areas that we would think would respond, and we do see the things the brain is responding differently. So we wanted to see the differences between the participants that have misokinesia and the participants that don't have misokinesia. And that was another study with null results, where it seems that the participants with the high misokinesia, they did not behave differently when they saw the oddball. So it's not that they're processing emotional faces differently. That's what we gathered from that study.
Do you find that it's tough to test people because you're lacking context? And what I mean by that is, with misophonia, it's tough because certain sounds we think of as being triggering, but without the context and the element of surprise and a bunch of other things, knowing what the source was, it can really affect how our reactions subconsciously are. Do you think that might be the case with misokinesia?
It could be. And when we're showing in both of these studies that we published, it wasn't actual fidgeting that we were looking at. We were looking at proxies to fidgeting. So maybe that was where we were limited. And so I actually followed this up with a couple more studies that are in the pipeline, like I mentioned earlier, where I haven't published them yet. One of them, we actually showed videos of somebody fidgeting, and they were talking about something. And then after that, we asked them, some participants, some questions about it, some memory questions there. And then what we wanted to see is if you're watching somebody fidgeting the entire time. So if I'm just doing this the entire time, is it that you're so distracted by my hand, you can't pay attention to what I'm doing? And this kind of came out of the idea that with Zoom calls and Zoom teaching, maybe participants that have misokinesia have a harder time listening to their instructors if the instructor moves around too much. And so that's what we followed up with. Again, it's a work in process. We're still looking through the data to see what's going on there. Is that actually happening? Do participants with high levels of misokinesia, do they actually respond lower when it comes to memory questions? And then I also followed this up with another study. Again, that's still going through the review process, where I actually asked participants that had high levels of misokinesia, how do you feel? Because we felt that we were just basing this on things that we thought misokinesia was. So we actually wanted to go out and ask participants, so what is actually bothering you? What symptoms do you have? How does this actually affect your daily lives? And we found some really interesting data there. Wow. So a little pitch there for a future misokinesia call that we can have.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found just anecdotally that on Zoom calls, it does distract me, but it's usually another participant. It's usually not the instructor. So if there's
Mhm.
20 people in a meeting, there'll be one person in the grid who's doing something fidgeting. And that's why I keep post-it notes handy, just to stick on the screen and
Mhm.
cover them up. So that's one adaptive thing. But
Yeah.
what you have several other papers coming out. Can you,
Mhm.
I know it's a little too early to kind of reveal, this is
Yeah.
not the iPhone reveal thing, but what kind of things are you working on now? And what is your dream misokinesia study in the future that you haven't started yet?
So right now we're actually doing a collaboration because we had somebody reach out to us who's a misophonia researcher from India who is interested in doing some misokinesia collaboration there. So we are working with them. Dr. Prabhu, I believe you've done a call with them earlier.
He's on the call right now.
Oh, hi.
From Hi,
So
Dr. Prabhu.
we are doing a study with him in the future,
Awesome.
and then we have. Oh, I had somebody reach out to me from New Zealand, who's working on some sort of glasses that will help block out some visual triggers for people that have misokinesia because she's an engineering student who has misokinesia. And
Mm.
she reached out, so we talked a little bit on misokinesia and what sort of things trigger participants. So now she's working on glasses. I'm not sure how it will look, but the idea came from the loop earrings that help block out frequencies for participants that have misophonia. So that's where that came from. For what the future looks like for me, so I just finished the PhD. I'm kind of reveling in the joy of not working
Right.
on my PhD at this point. But the future, I'm hoping to get more into the rehab side of things to help with the participants that have misokinesia to hopefully come up with some sort of treatment, rehabilitation, or something like that. But that is something that I need to work on to apply for those jobs that I haven't done yet.
Sure, there's a lot that needs to be done, and with misophonia, I'm sure it's the same with misokinesia that we know so little about it, and it's so prevalent that there's almost a never-ending wellspring of potential things that we could study about it in a way.
That's I thought that once I was done with the PhD, I'm done with this, but I just can't let it go. That is the reason I've stayed on as a researcher in my lab. That's why I decided to continue on with the work rather than just walking away with Dr. Prabhu there because I wanted to continue with this research because there's so many unanswered questions.
Yeah,
I just couldn't let it go.
and awareness. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm 50. I remember back in the 80s when I was in school trying to take tests with a foot shaker or a pin clicker or a hair twirl
Mhm.
or whatever. When I look back, this is not necessarily about me, but when I look back and try to remember when I first started experiencing symptoms of misophonia or misokinesia, the first thing I remember is misokinesia. In
Mhm.
fourth grade, there was a girl who was a hair twirler and a hair chewer in my class. And I remember here, decades later, still how frustrating that was.
Yeah.
So it does leave an imprint. Before we get to some of the questions from the audience, I had a couple of questions about how you might deal with situations, or have you noticed the crossover of prevalence? Somebody was asking actually about, do we know what the correlation between misophonia and misokinesia overlapping is yet, or is it too soon to tell?
It's definitely too soon to tell, but I've so far run 7 studies on this, and every study I have asked questions about misophonia, and there seems to be a high correlation between the two of them. So
Mhm.
there is an overlap, but there will be people that only have one but not the other. So it seems like they are related, but how related, I can't really say at this point yet.
Yeah, anecdotally, I thought it was 100% of people with misophonia, but I knew that there were people with misokinesia who didn't have misophonia. But that is not true. I've met plenty of people like yourself who have misophonia and don't really have misokinesia. So that would be interesting to find out. The future is looking bright for the career of a misokinesia researcher because it's so prevalent. What are some other interesting things out of the the few studies that you've done that you found that maybe weren't covered that you thought were interesting or novel? You said a number of your tests sort of resulted in null, which is great. It's great to have a hunch about something and then try to test for it and find out, oh, actually that hunch was mistaken, but we learned something from it.
Yeah.
What are some takeaway bits of information that you think are really relevant to what comes to mind for you?
Just how severe it can be for participants that have it. I didn't realize how it could be. where I thought that, okay, yeah, it bothers people, but then, like you just mentioned, you remember it decades later, or how people mention that they can't maintain romantic relationships. They've never been in a romantic relationship. They can never imagine being with somebody because if they do one simple thing, that's just it for them. And how it's really traumatizing for people in terms of their family relationships. One of the participants that talked to, who they couldn't maintain a relationship with their parents, they couldn't have a relationship with their partner, because of their misokinesia. And when I started this research, I did not think that it would be that severe for some people. Of course, we're talking about the more severe levels of misokinesia, but I did not think that that would be the case at all.
Yeah, it's really, it can be very heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm.
We have a challenge in the misophonia world, and I would imagine also in the misokinesia world, which I have both, trying to communicate just how much of an impact it has on people's lives. They have your general person off the street has trouble going from, oh, I don't like this sound, to, no, this affects me every day. There are certain jobs that I've quit. Like you said, there's
Mm-hmm.
relationships and friendships I cannot be in. I can't be around my parents, so on and so forth. Like, just the impact can be huge. And people
Yeah.
kind of have a problem realizing that it does affect us every day. And it's interesting that you found that also with misokinesia. Um,
Yeah.
and did people express difficulties in schooling and workplace and all those sorts of things that we hear also from misophonia?
And that's what I got also because I was doing those video calls during COVID. That's what I also gathered, that COVID actually was helpful for some of these participants in
Oh
terms
yeah.
of staying at home with work. A few of them were corporate workers who couldn't not work in an office, but then due to COVID, they were working from home. So now they didn't have to work around other people that were fidgeting. And then same thing with schooling. If an
Mhm.
instructor was bothering them, they just basically hid the screen. They didn't need to look at the screen. But if it was actually in the lecture hall, they had to look at the instructor. So
Mhm.
that's what I got there as well. Yeah, work and school was affected for participants as well.
Yeah, work from home is one of those common accommodations that we ask for. Anybody have any questions? The one question we had, this an interesting discussion with Dr. Prabhu and some other folks. So I'm glad. Thank you for answering the question, CJ and Prashant. Um, let's see. I think I got the prevalence one. One of the ones I wanted to ask you about is, we sometimes encounter when we're working with students or people who need accommodations at work, and so on and so forth. We kind of run into conflicting needs, conflicting comfort needs. There's a lot of conditions, from anxiety disorders, autism, um, others, where people need to move. They do
Hmm.
stimming, which they find very soothing, and must do those things. Uh, habitual movements, making sounds, even with Tourette, making sounds habitually.
Yeah.
And those are very comforting to people, but those seem like the complete opposite, like the nemesis of somebody with misokinesia and misophonia. And we sometimes have struggles with a classroom setting or an open office setting where one person needs to do something that's triggering to the other person. Did you hear stories of those sort of conflicts in your work?
Yeah, I did have a participant that was dating somebody that had Tourette's, and
Oh,
how
wow.
they were having difficulty maintaining their relationship because they really loved each other, but then the Tourette's was a major trigger.
I can
So they were
imagine.
trying to figure out ways to work that out. I didn't follow up with them, but that was one of those ones where I was kind of amazed that they were trying to make that relationship work with Tourette's. And
Hmm.
yes, the with ADHD, with the need for fidgeting, because they need that in order to focus, and we've seen that in research again and again, that those fidget toys, they definitely help participants that have ADHD. And then now, when you're looking at that's triggering for participants that have misokinesia. That's why I actually had a whole section in my PhD about that, about the fidget toys and how
Hmm.
they are helpful, and that we do need to have empathy for the other side of this spectrum as well, because
Absolutely.
people do need to do those movements, and how we can't just all out say no more fidget toys because people will need those
That
as
would be
well.
unfair to a lot of people as well.
Yeah.
Let's see. I have misophonia, misokinesia, and my son has Tourette's, sounded movement. There might be more of a correlation between those things than we think. Anecdotally, we sort of think of them, and with misophonia, there's been some phenotyping where we can see there's a cluster of types of conditions that misophonia exists in with other conditions. Have you seen that, or is that something we're going to look into with misokinesia to see what if it's not actually related to misophonia at all and we're wrong?
Yeah, I think if that's where I struggle with this too, of how much overlap it actually has, because if there was a direct overlap, then I would have probably seen more results than I actually found, where I kept getting null results, because a lot of those studies that we did run, we were trying to basically come up with a visual analog for what research has already published on misophonia. The oddball study that you were talking about, there was actually an auditory oddball study that we were trying to adapt to a visual oddball. So if there was a direct link between the two, maybe we would have found something, maybe not. Again, we don't actually know how much they actually overlap.
That is a great question. Another question, does the trigger have to be repetitive motion, or could it be a one-time gross movement? I'd like to hear your answers so that I can answer from my own experience, but I'm just one person, but I'm interested to hear if you found that this notion that is repetitive is important or not.
That's the definition that I'm working with, that it has to be repetitive movements. Those are the repetitive movements that I've asked my participants about, the trigger repetitive movements. I'm not sure if gross movements would fit in that definition. But again, future research could definitely look into that. What's your take on this for somebody that has this?
For me, it's I think that seeing visuals that I associate with repetitive movements can be. I'll give you a weird example. We sell T-shirts on our shop for our gift shop, and the company that prints these has sort of boilerplate models that you can put them on, so you can post them. And one of the models it's a still photo of somebody holding their hair as though they were twirling it. So even without me seeing the movement, I could picture that this model was doing that, and I found it sort of triggering, which was weird. So I wasn't seeing it; I was just associating it with my memories of visual repetitive motion.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if maybe it's just the correlation can also be triggering.
We did ask the question from our participants that if you know somebody's a problem fidgeter, do you experience anxiety before you approach them? And most of the participants did say yes, that if they know this person is going to fidget, they just have anxiety looking at them.
It's weird. I experience both, and I think it's just so fascinating and strange. A couple of questions. Have you found that the triggers are more intense with close relationships as opposed to strangers, which we do see in misophonia? Great question. If my husband does something, it triggers me, while a stranger doing the same action, maybe not so much. Did you find that?
Definitely. There does seem to be a psychosocial context there, where who is producing the movement definitely matters. And yes, we do see that in the misophonia research as well, where maybe it's that you feel more comfortable telling your partner to stop doing something than to tell your stranger, or you find that you've already told your partner to stop doing that. Why are they still doing that movement?
Absolutely.
So maybe, and I do find that with my husband too, with the chewing noises. I've told you so many times, why are you still chewing?
You know this. We've talked about this.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So maybe the time there also matters. If you've been with your partner for so many years now, that does matter as well.
Yeah. And relationships are tough with this. In misophonia, even, we hear a lot of people who they sleep in separate bedrooms because of snoring, and it can have a big impact and require a lot of improvisation and understanding. Dr. Heather Hansen has a great question, actually. Does a misokinesic, that might be the coining of that term, Dr. Hansen, misokinesic trigger need to be produced by a human being? Can a mechanical object, like a swinging grandfather clock, trigger misokinesia? Great question.
When I asked participants what things trigger them, most of them were human movements, but object movements like pen clicking was the one that was the top one that I got, but I did not hear anything about the clock, because again, that comes more for the noise maybe, rather than the visual trigger of that. I'm not too sure.
Yeah, it would be interesting. There's a lot of non-human repetitive motions, I guess, that we could try to test for fans and swinging, I don't know, curtains or something.
And I did ask about, sorry to interrupt.
No, you're not interrupting. Go ahead.
That babies move fidgeting, or animals fidgeting, like animals scratching or something like that. Most of the participants said no, but some participants did say that it does bother them as well. So it seems like it's very different depending on who it is involved.
That's all exactly the same in misophonia. Yes, most people not with pets. Some people, like me, unfortunately, also triggered by pets sometimes. I have a one-time gross movements many times from TV or people in person. So sometimes gross movements maybe are a part of it. Elise Glassman says or asks, do you have any thoughts on how to talk about misokinesia with families or employers? This has been a tough one for me due to so little research and feeling like it's much harder to explain. Great question. We're maybe a couple of years ahead of misokinesia and misophonia, but we're still lacking diagnostic criteria that physicians can refer to validate it, and diagnostic codes and so forth. And it's an uphill battle asking for accommodations because some people look at it and say, this doesn't exist, this isn't a real thing. What kinds of input do you have on how that could improve, or how to talk about it with validity?
I've noticed that, so I teach at a local college here, and one of the accessibility accommodations that I got recently was somebody that had misokinesia, misophonia, where they couldn't sit with other people writing an exam. And so they did ask to write all of their exams in a separate room. And so it seems like universities and colleges are catching up to this, but I think for employers it's going to take some time. And I think research is the best way because it sort of validates people. Maybe it's elitist that way, that hey, it's real because now an academic says that it's real.
Yeah, and that really comes to what I've learned. Professionals like you and people in the medical profession probably understand this better than I do, but it's the difference between the medical model and the social model. So in the medical model, your physicians and your doctors and your researchers are the experts, and they are in many ways. We're very thankful for them. But it's like our personal experiences aren't valid unless they can say, oh, this person's personal experiences are valid, which is kind of maybe problematic.
Yeah, that's what I was like. Maybe it's elitist to think that way.
Right. Absolutely. Another question. Have you noticed maybe if a trigger is something that the other person cannot control, like with ADHD or autism, the stimming we're talking about, does it become less triggering? It's a good question.
I did notice that. So with that partner that I was talking about that had the couple that had somebody that had Tourette's and the other person had misokinesia, it seems like they were more accommodating of that. They were trying to be more understanding that, hey, this person can't stop doing this. So I think that's where it is, that for some people, I'm sure for some people, they still can't live with somebody that has Tourette's or somebody that is fidgeting all the time because they have ADHD. But maybe for some people, if it's not as severe, maybe they can be more understanding or less triggered by it.
Absolutely.
I think it's very personal.
I think so too. And I'm curious, I'm trying to think about my misokinesia experiences. So this is just from my own experience. But if I know something, I can block something out visually. It's actually a little easier to block something out visually with holding screens around your desk at work and that kind of a thing. But did you hear as well that if I know somebody is still making the movement, even if I can't see it, I am still bothered by it, and I have to check to see if they're still doing it or not?
Most of the people did say that they either blocked the view of triggers, or they mimicked the movements, or they just walked away. But then even if after walking away, they're still thought about it. For some people for seconds, for some people it was minutes, for some people it was hours. Later they were still thinking about the movement.
Wow. Yeah, that's so many correlations. Dr. Prabhu, actually, welcome. Thank you for joining us. At present, according to you, what are the management options for individuals with misokinesia and those who have both misokinesia and misophonia? There's no treatment yet, so I know you're not a clinician, but if you were to talk to a clinician and they said, I've got this person with misokinesia really bad, how do I work with them? What kind of things might you recommend?
From, again, the people that I interviewed about this, they did say that most of them were using CBT as a way of dealing with, so that's cognitive behavioral therapy, as a way of dealing with their misokinesia symptomology, or mimicking. That was the main thing, where they felt that if they mimicked the movement, somehow it was not as triggering.
Interesting. Mercedes had a question about the incidence. She came in a little late. That's totally fine. The coincidence of misophonia and misokinesia, we don't know yet what that overlap is. Have you found anything about just feeling the vibration of the movement without seeing it being a trigger? This is a fantastic question. I was talking to Dr. Gregory in Chicago last week, Dr. Jane Gregory from Oxford, we're big fans of her work on misophonia. But you're sitting in a theater, all of the seats are connected. You're sitting in a seat down here, and somebody on this end is shaking their leg or kicking, and you can't see it or hear it, but you can feel it, and it is triggering. Have you had any reports of that?
Yeah, where couch shaking because the husband keeps tapping their foot. That was definitely one of the ones that was mentioned there. So that's what makes you think that maybe there is an overlap between misophonia, misokinesia, and a miso something with touch. Don't know what that word would be, but maybe there is something there where even that sensory modality triggers people, or just feeling the vibrations bothers people as well.
Yeah, I don't know what that word would be. We've talked about misotactia, which is a word that doesn't exist, but I think that would probably be more like textures and feelings, maybe not vibrations, but
Yeah.
maybe misotactia is the
Misohaptic.
Oh yeah, ooh. I gotta meditate on that. I think you're really onto something there.
Misohaptic.
Misohapia, that doesn't make sense. Anyway,
Yeah.
have you found anything? Okay, I was told to take Dramamine one time when I complained about a movement from yeah, there's, I don't know if you've experienced this. What have you heard from people who have gone to their physicians for misokinesia? One of the things we hear in the misophonia world, because there aren't any proven treatments yet, I think those are on the way for misophonia, a lot of clinicians will just throw something at their clients to see what sticks, and their misophonic clients sort of become unwitting guinea pigs for whatever medication, antipsychotic, who knows what, the vagus nerve diet, who knows that. Have you heard people saying, hey, my doctor didn't know what misokinesia was and just threw a bunch of stuff at me that didn't work, or maybe it helped?
I didn't get that from the interviews, but there is that paper by Webb in
Jaden Webb.
2022, yeah, where they did give beta blockers for somebody, but it was a case study, so it was just one individual that had misophonia and misokinesia. But medication was not something that came up in any of my interviews, no.
Interesting. I think we have a lot more to learn on it. You're right. That was a single case study. So it was one person's experiences with propranolol. So you can't read too much into it because that's one person's experiences. I know there are some larger scale propranolol misophonia studies being done. We'll have to see what those are, but I'm curious to see if they include misokinesia or not, or if that comes up. Definitely. We go and start wrapping up. Any final questions anybody has in chat for Sumeet? If not, we can start closing it down. What's next? We talked about what the future is. Oh, wait, Jennifer has a quick question. If your study, in your study, did you discover if individuals have adverse feelings to those close to them? Yeah, context and source, you said it was kind of one, for reasons we don't know, also with misophonia. So a lot of demand for your future work.
A lot of personal issues when it comes to this, where a lot of interpersonal problems, whether it's work, whether it's school, whether it's romantic relationships or family relationships, they all seem to be very much affected.
Yeah, absolutely. Upcoming studies we talked about. I know you have a few more papers in review. You probably can't tell us exactly what they are because they might change, or it's
the one that is the interview. That's why I've been talking about it the most, because it's going through the second round of reviews there. So hopefully that gets accepted soon. But that one's probably not going to change, hopefully, pending any reviewer comments there. But the other study with the videos, so that wasn't a neurophysiological study, but basically I had a recording of an instructor that was fidgeting or not fidgeting, talking about something, and then we asked how much the participants remembered what the person talked about, whether when they watched a video of somebody fidgeting or if they didn't watch somebody with fidgeting.
Interesting.
So that one's going to be an interesting one. But again, we submitted that, came back rejected. So now we've run 2 more follow-ups with that. So hopefully once that study wraps up, that should be okay. We don't have any neurophysiological studies in the pipeline, but we'll see where I end up after this PhD now, or what my supervisor ends up doing after I'm done as well.
Very cool. Well, we appreciate the work that you're doing. It's very exciting to be on, I guess, what they call the ground floor of the future of misokinesia research. We know it's incredibly prevalent. If it's a third of the population, that's over 100 million Americans alone. I don't know what the population fully of Canada is. So that is definitely something.
The population of California. That's the population of Canada.
Wow. I didn't even know what that is off the top of my head. I have to look that up. But that's a lot of people.
It's like 40 million.
Yeah, that's a lot of people. So spreading awareness about it, that it's a real condition and so forth, is going to be, I guess, the next steps, as well as the research.
Thank you.
We'll see if we can help out on that.
I really like the leap that you talked about, because I mentioned how I interviewed participants, but I got them from a Facebook support group because there was no other place that I could find participants that had high levels of misokinesia. So that's really cool that you have that organization, or that's the group. That would be really important for future research, for sure.
Feel free to reach out to us and use that. And we also have the research pool, which is a participant registry with over 1,100 people who have signed up to do misophonia research. But we have to assume that a majority of them also have misokinesia, and we're happy to share your research studies with them to try to find more participants.
That would definitely be good. Maybe Dr. Prevalent, I can talk about
Maybe
that.
so. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I know he's been traveling quite a lot. I follow him on Instagram, so I don't know if he's in India. And if so, thank you for being here in the middle of the night, Dr. Prabhu. But thank you so much, Sumeet. This is so fascinating. Thank you for researching Misokinesia and for dedicating your research to that. It is very important to a lot of us, as you mentioned. It has a huge impact on us, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. We'll post the recording of this soon. Live long
Thank
and
you, everyone,
prosper.
for joining. I did not think that many people would join. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thanks so much. All right. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Thanks,
Bye.
Sumeet. Take care.